Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
At this juncture, it may be plausible to suggest, but impossible to establish, that the 21st century in its third decade could be a turning point for the world order, similar to those in the late 18th and early 20th centuries, which could be the beginning of the end of the dominance of the United States in the world. But this, I believe, is mere speculation, for there is an important lesson that emerges from history. Dominant powers are always reluctant to cede economic or political space to newcomers that are rising powers. History reveals that the emergence of new centers of production in economics and new centers of power in politics does erode hegemonic dominance, but such changing realities remain unrecognized for long, often ignored. Thus, processes of change in the world order are always slow. What is more, this is a complex phenomenon which unravels and unfolds over a long period of time. Both the duration and the outcome of this process are unpredictable. Now, in my view, the present conjuncture is an interregnum, because the resurgence of Asia, except for China, is not large enough to shift the hegemonic balance. The United States remains the dominant economic and political and military power in the world, and even if it no longer seeks a proactive role in the world, possibly because its domestic political constituencies are not supportive of the idea, there is no other country yet that could replace the United States in this hegemonic role, which has multiple dimensions. Most importantly, perhaps, the United States is the only country that has a national currency which is the equivalent of international money.
In this episode, Professor Deepak Nayyar, Emeritus Professor of Economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and an honorary fellow at Balliol College, Oxford, analyzes the world order that was put in place at the end of World War II, examining how it has unfolded in terms of experience since then, and highlighting some important manifestations of its multiple crises, to discuss possible future scenarios for 2050. In doing so, he asks 4 key questions and seeks to provide answers. Are we witnessing the beginnings of a transformative change in the world order? Are we at the cusp of an emerging bipolar world order with the United States and China as the 2 superpowers? Are we moving towards a multipolar world in which there will be another 8 to 10 countries that are also key players? Are we going to live with a fluid situation and de facto continuation of Pax Americana? This episode was adapted from an event that took place at the Bangalore International Centre in February of 2025.
Good evening, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here with you at the Bangalore International Centre. I came here once many years ago when you had just started life and you were in the neighboring Terry building. I think it was 2014, 10 years ago. The title, as Sandhya has already announced, is From Pax Americana to Pax Mysteriana. For those of you who know Latin, you will wonder about my ignorance. The Latin word for mystery is mysterium, but I chose From Pax Americana to Pax Mysteriana because it is an alliteration. It rhymes, and it's clear what it means. Now, Sandhya has already outlined for you the object, the structure of my talk. So let me plunge right in. The existing world order at any juncture in time reflects the balance of global economic and political power. It can change over time as an outcome of decisive shifts in the balance. But history reveals that such changes are few. This is because the evolution of a world order is a slow process that may span a century or even longer, so that transitions from one to the next can stretch over decades. For this reason, a long-term historical perspective is essential, albeit brief. The Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century was a turning point for the world. It was the beginning of the end of Asia's overwhelming significance in the world economy. And it was the beginning of the rise of Europe, in particular Great Britain, to dominance in the world. For almost 150 years, the sun never set on the British Empire. In this age of colonialism and imperialism, British economic primacy was the implicit world order manifest in state power and naval power, which provided protection for its economic and political interests in distant lands as well as its merchant ships in distant waters. The early 20th century was the next turning point. It was the beginning of the end of Britain's dominance, and it was the beginning of the rise of the United States to dominance in the world. This process spanned half a century. The League of Nations, established after the First World War in 1920, as an intergovernmental organization to promote international cooperation and maintain international peace, was, we know, a miserable failure during the transition from Pax Britannica to Pax Americana, which was complete by 1950. At the end of World War II, which brought destruction and chaos across the globe, the United States sought to construct a new world order that was largely in place by the late 1940s. It was based on international institutions, rules, and practices in a quest for a broadly free international market, essentially underwritten by American economic strength and military power. This world order, which has spanned 75 years so far, is not without its limitations or flaws. Yet, it managed to preserve the peace between superpowers in the Cold War era and broadly in the world as a whole during the 1990s and 2000s, although it has struggled to cope since then. There were, of course, geographically bound conflicts, in many of which big nations lost small wars. It was also conducive to decades of rapid economic growth, unprecedented in human history, beginning with the post-war economic reconstruction in Europe, gathering momentum, and in Japan, gathering momentum in the era of markets and globalization during the 1980s, which improved living standards for ordinary people in the industrial north and lifted billions out of poverty in the global south, although it was associated with a rapid, almost exponential increase in economic inequalities between countries as well as people. But this existing world order is now under stress. The first 2 decades of the 21st century have witnessed a discernible change in the balance of global economic power. Financial crises have dented faith in markets. Mounting economic inequalities have created social and political discontents among people. International institutions are creaking at the seams. The IMF and the World Bank have failed to reinvent themselves for changed times. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, seems to be at a dead end. The United Nations system, which has lost its way, is neither credible nor effective. Even if the present world, may I say, sorely needs such an institution for its designated critical roles. Globalization is at risk. Economies are going through difficult times, if not crises, with growth slowdowns, double-digit inflation, and persistent or high unemployment. Politics within countries is contentious, if not polarized. The geopolitical divides are visible and sharper than they have been for decades. International relations are strained, and there are several flashpoints across the world. Clearly, this is a most difficult economic and political conjuncture for the world. The object of my talk is to analyze the world order that was put in place at the end of World War II, highlight the contours of its evolution and its multiple quiet crises 75 years later, to set the stage for discussing possible future scenarios in 2050. There is no obvious measure of how economic power is distributed between countries in the world. Even if imperfect, perhaps the best index is their share in world GDP, which would also highlight changes in their relative importance over time. Now, I've calculated the share of 3 major country groups, 7 geographical, almost continental regions, and 12 selected large countries in world GDP at current prices and market exchange rates during the period from 1970 to 2022, a little more than half a century. This statistical evidence spanning more than half a century reflects a very clear shift in the balance of economic power. So I'd urge you to be a little patient. I will mention numbers only for the next 5 minutes and not thereafter. It'll be words. Now, the change in the share of the 3 major country groups, once described as the East, the West, and the South, in world GDP, reveal very clear trends. First, the share of the former USSR and Eastern Europe dropped sharply from 15% in 1970 to 5% in 1990 and 2% in 2000, but stabilized at around 4% thereafter. Second, the share of industrialized countries, broadly speaking the West and Japan, was in the range of 68% until 1980. It rose to a level of 75-80% until 2005, but then dropped very sharply to 60% in 2015, after which it diminished further to 55% in 2022. Third, the share of developing countries remained in the range of 17%, and that's Asia, Africa, Latin America, until 2000, climbed steadily thereafter and rapidly during the period 2025 to 2015 to reach as much as 40% in 2022. Now, statistical evidence on the distribution of world GDP by geographical regions, North America, Europe, West, North, and South, Eastern Europe and the former USSR, industrialized Asia, which is essentially largely Japan, but also includes South Korea and Israel, developing Asia, Latin America, and Africa tells a very similar story. It shows that the share of North America and Europe was about 60% until 2005, but dropped to 50% in 2010 and 47% in 2022. The share of industrialized Asia, and that's an interesting story, rose from 6.4% in 1970 to a little over 18% in 1995, but fell back once again to 6.4% by 2022. The story of the former USSR and Eastern Europe, I have already mentioned, were dismal. The share of Latin America and the Caribbean was in the range of 5% for much of this period, while the share of Africa dropped from its peak of 5% in 1980 to less than 3% in 2022. The share of developing Asia increased steadily from a mere 8% in 1970 to 14% in 2005, after which it rose rapidly to reach 32% in 2022. And that's the highlight of this story. Now, the last set of numbers, the share of 12 selected large countries, neither in alphabetical order nor in order of GDP, the United States, Germany, France, UK, Japan, Russia, South Korea, China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, and Mexico, they are probably amongst the top 15 countries in the world in size of GDP, provides a more disaggregated, even if a less complete picture. It shows, and this is important to recognize, that the share of the United States in world GDP was in the range of 25 to 33%, 1/4 to 1/3 for the entire period. The story of Japan is a sharp contrast. its share rose from 6.2% in 1970 to almost 18% in 1995, but dropped sharply to 4% in 2022. The share of France and UK has fluctuated in the range 4-5% until 2010, and it diminished thereafter, while that of a unified Germany dropped from its peak level of 8% during 1995 to just about 5% in the 2000s, and dropped to 4% by 2022. The share of Brazil and Mexico remained mostly in the range of 1-2% throughout. The share of Russia, too, was 1-2% through the period 1995 to 2022, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The share of South Korea visibly improved from 0.3% in 1970 to 1.7% in 2000, stabilizing there, roughly, a smaller country. The share of Indonesia rose from 0.3% in 1970 to 1% in 2010, were no significant change thereafter. The share of India was in the range of 1-2% until 2005, but increased slowly to 3.5% by 2022. The stunning rise of China is striking. In 1990, the share of China was about the same as that of India and Brazil, but it increased steadily to 5% in 2005 and rose rapidly thereafter to reach 18% in 2022. In sum, and that's the end of the figures I'll give you, but it is important to get a sense of what they are. In sum, the period from 1970 to 2022 witnessed profound changes in the global balance of economic power, a rapid economic decline of the former USSR and Eastern Europe, the rise and fall of Japan, which stayed roughly where it was, an economic recovery in Western Europe, until 2000, followed by a relative decline that gathered momentum in 2010, and it suggests an absolute decline in the United Kingdom. Continued economic dominance of the West until 2000, and the steady rise of Asia, including the stunning rise of China since 2000. The significance of the United States reflected in its share of world GDP in the range of 1/4 to 1/3 was perhaps the only reality that did not change. Now, let me turn to the multiple crises that afflict this world order. The raison d'etre of any world order is simple. National laws would suffice if economic space coincides broadly with geographical space. However, in the contemporary world, we know economic space extends much beyond geographical or political space. Moreover, conflicts or wars between countries arise from the pursuit of national interests as perceived by governments. But countries are not subject to any international laws because there is no world government or parliament that can enact laws that are binding on nations. Obviously, creating rules or laws that are binding on sovereign nation states, which implies ceding national sovereignty in some respects, is difficult since it is subject to mutual acceptance. Yet, a world order, a broadly acceptable framework, is both necessary and desirable to preserve global public goods such as peace, environment, or human health, and to regulate global public bads such as wars, environment degradation, or pandemics. Now, in recent times, the existing world order has been unable to perform such a role. Examples abound. The Russia-Ukraine war that started in early 2022, I'll just give you 3 examples, disrupted global supply chains in food and fuels. Russia and Ukraine together are an important source of supply for wheat, maize, edible oils, and fertilizers in the world market, while Russia is a primary source of oil and natural gas. This has led to double-digit inflation that has hurt the poor and vulnerable, particularly in North Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and in some parts of South Asia. The Israel-Hamas conflict that erupted on both sides of the Gaza Strip could escalate into a larger war and shatter the fragile peace in the Middle East, leading to a further spike in oil prices with dire consequences for the world economy. Now, these wars might be localized, but if they continue, they are bound to have a global impact. Alas, there is no credible or effective institutional mechanism in the world order that could help restore peace. Environmental degradation and climate change stare us in the face. There are more frequent occurrences across the world of forest fires, floods, droughts, excess rainfall, rising sea levels, receding glaciers, temperatures above 50 degrees Celsius in Beijing or in the south of the United States, or wet bulb temperatures in India at which humans cannot survive, and so on. Humankind, it seems to me, is mortgaging its future. In every sphere, please remember that the poor and the marginalized are the most vulnerable. Of course, even the rich are not immune. Yet, effective progress is much too slow. The scrutiny of actions on pledges made in the 2015 Paris Agreement at successive COP meetings since then is simply ineffective. Countries wax eloquent in comfort because none of these are binding obligations, and they are in any case to be met sometime in the distant future. The global coronavirus pandemic turned the world upside down for 2 years, imposing an enormous burden on economies and peoples everywhere. The total number of the deaths in the world associated with COVID-19 is estimated by the WHO at about 7 million. It was simply not recognized that problems without passports need solutions without passports. Instead, at a time when international collective action was an imperative, the response of governments was driven by perceived national interests, erecting national barriers to international travel, despite the knowledge that microbes, germs, and viruses will inevitably cross borders, or accumulating vaccines when so many people in other countries remain unvaccinated. The most effective response would have been international cooperation instead of a myopic pursuit of illusory national interests. Now, at this juncture, it would seem that the willingness and ability of governments to coordinate in terms of implementing the much needed collective action has been exacerbated by a widespread resurgence of nationalisms. In the West, nationalist conservative political parties are in office as governments, or a part of coalition governments, or close contestants for political power in elections to come. Similarly, in a number of countries in the global south, populist authoritarian regimes, political parties, or leaders, often elected through a democratic process, which is precisely what they seek to undermine, articulate their strong belief in nationalism. Inevitably, such political ideologies stress their perception of national interests, sometimes and more so associated with the militarism that is reminiscent to me of the world a century ago in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Inevitably, such political ideologies stress their perception of national interests, sometimes associated with the militarism. In doing so, and this is important, they often erode the autonomy of institutions and the freedoms of citizens. It is no surprise that such governments shun the idea of international cooperation, for it is perceived as ceding space in terms of national sovereignty. Now, the present world, let me turn to possible scenarios for 2050. The present world order is confronted with the fundamental problem that the balance of power is now very different from what it was in 1945. The rise of developing Asia, concentrated in China, which gathered momentum after 1990, has slowly chipped away at the economic dominance and political hegemony of the United States and Western Europe. The story, may I stress, is about more than China. In 2022, the share of China in world GDP was 18%, while that of the rest of developing Asia was 14%. Now, the geopolitics of the world has also changed profoundly because of unexpected developments. The United States, in a withdrawal syndrome, appears to be relinquishing its leadership role in the world. Be that as it may, the decline of Western Europe in a relative rather than absolute sense is discernible. The globalization of Islam also seeks to challenge Western hegemony. Of course, by far the most significant change is the rise of China, with its aspiration for a superpower status at par with the United States. At this juncture, it may be plausible to suggest, but impossible to establish, that the 21st century in its third decade could be a turning point for the world order, similar to those in the late 18th and early 20th centuries, which could be the beginning of the end of the dominance of the United States in the world. But this, I believe, is mere speculation, for there is an important lesson that emerges from history. Dominant powers are always reluctant to cede economic or political space to newcomers that are rising powers. History reveals that the emergence of new centers of production in economics and new centers of power in politics does erode the hegemonic dominance, but such changing realities remain unrecognized for long, often ignored. Thus, processes of change in the world order are always slow. What is more, this is a complex phenomenon which unravels and unfolds over a long period of time. Both the duration and the outcome of this process are unpredictable. Now, in my view, the present conjuncture is an interregnum, because the resurgence of Asia, except for China, is not large enough to sift the hegemonic balance. The United States remains the dominant economic and political and military power in the world, and even if it no longer seeks a proactive role in the world, possibly because its domestic political constituencies are not supportive of the idea, there is no other country yet that could replace the United States in this hegemonic role, which has multiple dimensions. Most importantly, perhaps, the United States is the only country that has a national currency which is the equivalent of international money. So an overwhelming proportion of trade, investment, and finance between countries is denominated in US dollars, just as both public and private debt is denominated in US dollars. It's the institutional dimension of its dominance is diminishing because the world has changed profoundly since then, and the political framework for international cooperation and peace is there, part of the old US world order, but no longer credible or effective. Given this fluid and uncertain situation, I believe that we are at the early stages of a world order in transition. We can only speculate about alternative future scenarios of a world order that might emerge by 2050, a quarter century from now, or even later. Now, I pose these alternatives in the form of 4 questions. First, are we witnessing the beginnings of a transformative change in the world economy, or world order, over the next 25 years? Second, are we at the cusp of an emerging bipolar world yet again, as it was in the Cold War era, with the United States and China as the 2 superpowers? Third, are we moving towards a multipolar world in which the United States and China may be the key players, but there will be another 8-10 countries that are also key players? Fourth, are we going to live with a fluid situation where the world order remains in transition, even for the next 25 years? Now, I will endeavor to provide my answers to each of these questions in turn. This is bound to be speculative. Yet, thinking ahead, I believe, is part of the way forward. Now, there are observers who believe that we are witnessing the beginnings of a transformative change in the world over the next 25 years. The recent rise of Asia and the emerging powerhouse economies in Asia, among which China is the most visible, has led to an idea or hope voiced by some that the 21st century could turn out to be the Asian century. The parallels drawn sometimes are with Great Britain in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th century, when the dominance of these countries was reflected in politics, economics, and even culture. There can be little doubt that circa 2050, a century after the end of colonial rule, Asia will account for at least 2/5, if not 1/2, of world income and will be home to about 3/5 of the people on Earth. It will have not only an economic significance, which was the reality in 1820, but also a political significance in the world that would have been difficult to imagine in 1970. In terms of income per capita, however, it will be nowhere near as rich as the United States or Western Europe. Thus, Asian countries such as China, India, and Indonesia will emerge as world powers, but without the income levels of the rich countries. Asia will not have the dominance that Great Britain did in the past, or the United States has even now in withdrawal syndrome, straddling the economic sphere and the political realm, which, while stretching beyond those to culture. Moreover, there is a fundamental flaw in this comparison. Great Britain and the United States were states that were hegemons. Asia is a continent in geographical space, comprising 48 countries, with a total population of 4.8 billion that stretches across a vast geographical space from East Asia through Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, and on to West Asia. Given this heterogeneity, juxtaposed with these contradictions and conflicts, it is difficult even to imagine a Pax Asiana. For different reasons, and I'll come to that in a moment, a Pax Sinica, China-led, is just as difficult to imagine. In my view, therefore, the idea of an Asian century is hyperbole rather than a plausible prospect. The idea that we are at the cusp of an emerging bipolar system world yet again, as it was in the Cold War era, with the United States and China as the two superpower rivals this time around, competing for their respective spheres in the world, is more plausible, but does require systematic analysis. Now, given the time constraint, I'm only going to provide a brief intuitive assessment of this hypothesis using plausible reasoning. At the outset, it must be recognized that for the USSR, superpower rivalry with the United States was political. It was driven by ideology and reinforced by military power with no parity in income levels. In that sense, China is similar. However, there is a fundamental difference in the economic dimensions of the relationship. There was almost no economic engagement between the United States and the erstwhile USSR. In sharp contrast, the Chinese economy is interlocked with the American economy through international trade, international investment, international finance. Indeed, more than 50%, close to 60% of China's massive foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollar bonds or US Treasury bills. Now, in the early 1930s, Keynes wrote that if you owe someone £100, go back, index it to 1930, it's your problem. If you owe someone £1 million, it's their problem. So China does have a problem in this respect vis-a-vis the United States. Now, the notion of a bipolar world is often based on projections of GDP. For example, those by Goldman Sachs or by OECD, which are simply linear extrapolations based on assumptions. But the real world is not about the arithmetic of compound growth rates. Sure, if national income grows at 10% per annum, you will double it in 7 years. If per capita income grows at 7% per annum, you will double per capita income in 10 years. The critical determinants of growth underlying such projections are three: population, productivity, and the exchange rate, because you're making international comparisons. Now, for China, its surplus of labor is exhausted, and its workforce has peaked. So that economic growth in China will now depend entirely on productivity increase, which most analysts believe will be at most 3% per annum. If that is lower, growth will slow further. Similarly, any fall in fertility rates, and fertility rates have begun to decline in China, will have the same effect and dampen growth. Just as important, such projections of catch-up in GDP are very sensitive to assumptions about prices, particularly the exchange rate. Therefore, if the appreciation of the Chinese yuan is less than expected, the date for catching up with the United States GDP will be deferred further in time. Now, you might recall when Jim O'Neill did the first BRICS projections, that China was going to overtake the United States in GDP in 2025. Slowly, that shifted to 2035, 2045. It's now 2055. I'm not going to be around in 2055, but I am convinced that the US will still have the much larger GDP. It will be the largest economy in the world. But most importantly, my belief that China has peaked comes from a world beyond economics. The most important underlying assumption is that the political system in China will be a continuation of the past 50 years. Okay? Now, it's not as if President Xi Jinping is very powerful, but there are discontents that are rising. In sum, I'm skeptical about the notion of a bipolar world in 2050. The most likely scenario, and I must say it's my preferred scenario, in 2050 is a multipolar world in which dominance might not be so striking. The United States and China will most probably be the leading countries with an economic and political significance in the world. But I think this group will be much larger. Among the industrialized high-income countries, it will include Germany and France for sure. Britain, it seems to me, is now in absolute decline. I will put it there 2 years ago. I'm not sure I would put it there now. As well as Japan from Asia. Taken together, these countries account for a little more than 1/6 of world GDP at present. It will almost certainly include India and Indonesia from developing Asia, and Brazil, and plus Brazil and Mexico from Latin America. Beyond these 10 countries, there may be other countries in the group, including Russia, but that is very difficult to predict. Russia's share of world GDP is only 1.7% at this moment. In such a multipolar world, the distribution of economic and political power will be less unequal than at present, but large asymmetries will remain. Of course, much as I like the idea, the mere existence of such a multipolar world cannot create a new world order. This would require cohesion and cooperation amongst the two biggest players, the US and China, with a smaller subset, say, of 10 countries. But it would also have to be based on consultations with a much larger number of countries to evolve a framework for a world order that is mutually acceptable. This might be feasible if there is a shift in the balance of economic power in the world such that 10 countries, the other 10, taken together are larger than one of the two big countries and closer to the other in economic size. If this does happen, it would conform to the idea of a multipolar world, genuinely multipolar world. It would also reduce, even though it cannot eliminate, the present democratic deficit in the world order. Okay, now, so what does this lead to? The most probable outcome, in my view, is that we are going to live with a fluid situation where the world order remains in transition over the next 25 years, so that there is a de facto continuation of Pax Americana. This is essentially what we might call in today's parlance the default option. The construction of a new world order is now far more difficult now than it was 75 years ago. The reason is obvious. There has been a profound change in the global distribution of economic power over the past 75 years. In 1950, the United States was the dominant economic and political power. The past 2 decades, since the early 2000s, have witnessed an erosion in its economic dominance and political hegemony, even though its share of world GDP has remained roughly the same. Hence, at this juncture, no single country has the dominance to create a new world order as the United States could and did in 1950. Building a consensus to address cross-national and cross-domain challenges is increasingly more difficult, so apparent from this very painfully slow progress in climate change negotiations. Let alone efforts at preserving peace in the world. Aging populations, food shortages, water scarcities, recurring pandemics are the new challenges confronting the world. Their economic consequences might reinforce nationalisms, xenophobic attitudes, and even militarisms. The possible impact of profound technological changes on the horizon, which you read about every day, only adds to the complexity and the uncertainty. Of course, the United States retains some essential attributes of a hegemon in its economic size, in its technological cutting edge, in its military strength, in its political influence, in its soft power, and above all, in a national currency that's the equivalent of international money. However, its engagement with and commitment to the world order it created in the late 1940s has been significantly diminished by its withdrawal syndrome. This is manifest in the reluctance of domestic political constituencies to let their government perform such a role. Now, a political polarization, which we now see in the US, is associated often with a legislative gridlock that makes the task even more difficult. But that is not all. The soft power and the moral credibility of the United States has also been eroded by the divergence between proclaimed principle and actual practice. Legal exceptionalism, unilateral sanctions, which depart from a rules-based world order that it created. Now, in this context, a commitment to and participation in forging sustainable policies to combat climate change will do more to restore its moral credibility than any other single step. Yet, the emergence of another hegemon in the world could replace the United States does not seem to me a plausible idea at this juncture. A quarter century from now, a multipolar world is possible, even probable outcome. However, the ability of a dozen countries in this multipolar world to cooperate with each other, as well as consult a wider range of smaller countries to construct a new world order, is a more distant prospect. Thus, the default option of a prolonged interregnum in which the world order remains in crisis and transition is where we are most likely to be in 2050. Historical experience suggests that crises or wars that lead to decisive shifts are the catalysts of change. This was so in 1945. Economic and political realities have changed profoundly since then. I think the world should not have to wait another crisis of such proportions to act. The existing world order is clearly under stress, the symptoms are worrisome, and there are alarm bells. We can only hope that enlightened self-interest and wise political leadership of major countries, which is clearly not on the horizon, will provide the impetus for international cooperation and collective action. Now, if I was doing this talk 3 months ago, I could happily have concluded here. However, Donald Trump was elected president of the United States in early November and assumed office as president of the United States in late January, barely 6 weeks ago. So, the unexpected can and does happen. What are the implications and consequences of Donald Trump, you might ask, for the world order and the crisis in crisis and transition that I have focused on over the last 40 minutes? John Maynard Keynes made a distinction between risk and uncertainty. Risk is something you can model. Risk is something you can assign probabilities to. Risk is something you can insure against. But uncertainty is pure uncertainty. Now, Donald Trump is about uncertainty. He epitomizes uncertainty. You all read the newspapers. He says one day that I shall withdraw from the WHO. He says 2 days later that I will stay in the WHO if a United States citizen is appointed Director General. He says that he will turn the Gaza Strip into the equivalent of a French Riviera and resettle 2 million Palestinians somewhere else in the world whom no one is willing to accept. And he changes his mind. Now, I am engaging in loud thinking. I have no means of knowing. I have no crystal ball. And to understand what Donald Trump may or may not do requires someone with superhuman knowledge. I don't have that. But what can we observe? And what is it that is between the lines? The said and the unsaid, simply put. On what is said, Donald Trump has made it clear that he will bring the wars between Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Hamas to an end. Okay? He will end both wars, but he will end both wars in a partisan manner because he's clearly aligned himself with Vladimir Putin, just as he aligned himself with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So it's a kind of pro-Russian, pro-Israel stance to end the war. The question is, how will it sustain? Hamas and the Palestinians won't disappear from the face of the earth. Ukraine will not disappear. It may be overrun. Donald Trump is also very clear about reciprocal tariffs, a return to what I call mercantilism. Exports are good, imports are bad. So if you run a trade surplus, you're a bad guy. And if you run a trade deficit, you're a good guy. Now, he actually, in doing so, the WTO has been almost dead for 10 years because the United States has not allowed this dispute settlement mechanism to function. It doesn't have judges to perform that function. And now he seeks to bury what is almost dead. But there were two important underlying principles in the erstwhile GATT and the present WTO. One was the principle of non-discrimination, and the other was the most favored nation clause. In other words, if I offer access to my market on a set of terms to country A that is a member of the WTO, then I must offer exactly the same terms, the most favored nation clause. And that there's a principle of non-discrimination. The only exception was, say, the European Union or common markets or customs unions, which were written into the WTO agreements. Three, Trump is making noises much like President McKinley in the early 20th century, President of the United States, who actually was probably imperialist. Now, the US has never been explicitly imperialist because it was a colony itself, colonized by the British. The only colony it had was the Philippines. Yeah? But in effect, during the between 1900 and 1914, the US almost acquired hegemony over most Latin American countries. Now, the US did not do that. It fought its own wars and lost many of them in Afghanistan, in Vietnam, for ideological purposes. But he now seeks to acquire Greenland, to think of Canada as a 51st state, to rename the Panama Canal, to rename the Gulf of Mexico. Grandiose ideas, but a lot of it is bluster. I don't know certainly he will end the Russia-Ukraine war. He will end the Israel-Hamas conflict. But with what consequences is not clear. There is a lot that is unsaid also. Donald Trump, before he was elected, engaged the Heritage Foundation in the United States to do a study on what he should do should he be elected president of the United States to the world order the United States created. Now, I understand it's not in the public domain, but a withdrawal from the United Nations is on the cards. And if not that, a sharp cutback in US support for the United Nations. China's contribution to the United Nations has increased in recent years, but is no substitute for the kind of support the UN provided to the UN system. But what is more, the Bretton Woods twins, the World Bank and the IMF, the Heritage Foundation is suggesting that the United States should withdraw from it. Now, the United States has a 17.5% share in the World Bank and the IMF, enough to veto any change in its Articles of Association. But 83% is owned by other countries. They could conceivably keep the World Bank and the IMF going. The relationship with Western Europe is half said and half unsaid. NATO countries, other than the United States, have to pay for themselves for their defense. But whether Trump will keep the NATO going is less than clear. He has said nothing yet about Latin America, Africa, and Asia, except China and India, where he has specific concerns about high tariffs, except on immigration and on tariffs. Thus far, everything that has been said, although much less has been done, suggests that Donald Trump has no desire or intention of preserving the world order that was established by the United States in the late 1940s. The statements are negative or disruptive. And there is not even a hint of creative destruction. Joseph Schumpeter used the phrase creative destruction, which was a natural part of capitalism, that you have to be creative if you dismantle something. But at this moment, the only evidence I see is of dismantling and withdrawing, but not what would be put in place. All I can see, before and after the election of Trump is a withdrawal syndrome. Now, the question, I don't know the answer, I can only speculate, is this feasible? For one, at home in the United States, for another, in the outside world. Now, if you think of Trump's campaign agenda and what he has explicitly issued so many executive orders on, he wishes to introduce reciprocal tariffs, and there is despite the Indian media going soft that we have a special relationship, it will be China and India for sure, and a lot of other countries, with no concessions. Actually, he announced that yesterday. On April 1st, these will come into effect. And he's bringing an end to, he says, to immigration. But it seems to me at this moment it is bluster, because all that he is doing is deporting people who were detained crossing the border from Mexico into the United States or Canada into the United States. The US is impossible to go into the US, bound by the Atlantic and the Pacific. The only way in is through Mexico. And so there was a symbolic, you send them sort of handcuffed, feet in chains and so on. But the Pew Research Center in the US estimates that there are 750,000 undocumented migrants, which is the American terminology for illegal immigrants, in the United States. And there are 5 million undocumented immigrants in the United States altogether, of whom a little less than 1/5 are from India, more than 1/6. Now, there is no way that he is going to be able to easily find them and deport them. The question is, what are I don't know what will happen on that, but the consequences are clear. The moment Trump introduces high reciprocal tariffs, the prices of imported consumer goods will rise. The United States at this moment has no capacity to produce labor-intensive manufactured consumer goods. At the same time, if it does come down on immigration, illegal immigrants, there will be there is dirty, demanding, and dangerous work in the US, which no US resident or citizen is willing to do. So whether it is plucking fruit in farms, whether it's working as shop assistants, whether it's working on construction, cleaning windows, repairing roads, all you see is illegal immigrants, mostly from Central America. So two things will happen. A, prices of goods will rise. B, wages will rise. Because to get people to replace them to do this work will mean upward pressure on wages. Now, whether he can sustain its politics, I am not sure. Now, it is, in a sense, a naked power politics reminiscent of imperialism when the British Empire was its zenith in the late 19th century. But the world is very different now. It is not what it was 1870 to 1914 that Hobsbawm called the age of empire. And it's also very different from what it was in the late 1940s when the US political power and economic dominance was at its peak. Okay? Now, let me conclude. It's been 40 minutes since I started, just 2 minutes more. In conclusion, and there can be no definite conclusion, you can see we are in a world of uncertainty. It would seem that Donald Trump has a disdain for multilateralism, which provided the essential foundations for the world order that was created by the United States in the late 1940s. The pronouncements of President Trump so far and actions suggest that he has a clear revealed preference for bilateralism and at best plurilateralism, which is consistent with his transactional approach to international relations in the sphere of the economic and in the realm of the political. This bluster is easier said than done. For one, he does not have the imperial power that Great Britain had during the Age of Empire, nor does he have the economic and political dominance bordering on hegemony that the United States had in 1945. For another, the geopolitics of the contemporary world is diverse and complex. Western Europe and Japan are in relative decline. China is on the rise. Russia aspires for a seat at the high table, but we also have the rest of Asia rising. A Latin America of middle-income countries in churn, and an underdeveloped Africa with an enormous potential implicit, embedded in the reality that it is the only continent where population growth will continue during the second half of the 21st century. Any settlement with one will have spillovers elsewhere. The global south is a phrase I dislike, but much as I don't like the phrase, we need to recognize that Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean together in 2023 accounted for 80% of world population and 40% of world GDP. So that they are not inconsequential in the process. Now, I'm sorry to conclude on this uncertain note, but as I said, I don't have a crystal ball. We need to recognize that Trump may be introducing a new world disorder. It's also possible.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Center. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.